One winter day in 1732, in the red soil of Pope's Creek, Virginia, one of the 13 British colonies in North America, a boy was born into a prominent tobacco-planting family. That boy was named George Washington. No one, not even himself, could have imagined that one day that name would echo throughout history as the founding figure of a nation. His father, Augustine Washington, was not only a noble landowner, but also a shrewd businessman. He owned multiple tobacco plantations and managed iron mining operations in Virginia and Maryland in partnership with England's Principio Company. Besides business, he was also a prominent figure in the community, having served as a judge, sheriff, and militia officer in Westmoreland County. Augustine's life was tied to two women. His first wife, Jane Butler, bore him 4 children before passing away in 1729. 2 years later, in 1731, he remarried a 23-year-old woman named Mary Johnson Ball, who would give him 6 more children, and George was the eldest. Mary was born in 1708. She lost her father at the age of 3, and her mother at 12. Her father left her 400 acres of land, an orphaned girl raised by George Eskridge, a close family friend. And perhaps it was this relationship that led her to meet Augustine, marry into the Washington family, and name her firstborn son George to honor the man who had raised her. At the time, George was just one among thousands of subjects of the British Empire in North America. No one could have foreseen that just a few decades later, he would lead a military rebellion against Britain, founding the United States and turning that land into an independent nation. George grew up in eastern Virginia, surrounded by endless fields, grand plantations, and small river towns. Though not part of the formal aristocracy under King George II's system, the Washingtons were still considered among the colonial elite, with over 10,000 acres of land. Augustine was a wealthy and successful man, though his wealth was built upon the labor of dozens of enslaved people, giving him the leisure to hunt, race horses, and expand his influence. George's childhood was marked by constant relocation following his father, who moved their assets to better manage his business interests. In 1735, the family moved to a 2,500-acre estate at Little Hunting Creek, along the Potomac River. 3 years later, they relocated again to Ferry Farm on the Rappahannock River, overlooking the port of Fredericksburg. From there, George could see ships loaded with tobacco, iron, and goods symbols of the coming industrial age. Throughout his youth, the person who influenced George most wasn't his parents, but his half-brother, Lawrence, 14 years his senior. Lawrence had been a student at Appleby Grammar School, where he later taught until he turned 20. Around this time, when George was 6, the two brothers met for the first time. George heard tales of Lawrence's service as a captain in a Virginia military company. In 1739, the War of Jenkins' Ear broke out, a violent clash between Britain and Spain, named after a gruesome incident where a British captain had his ear cut off in a naval skirmish. Lawrence joined an expedition led by Admiral Edward Vernon. The target attacked Cartagena, a coastal Spanish fortress deep in South America. But hope quickly turned to disaster. Yellow fever ravaged the troops. Enemy defenses were fierce, and the expedition was nearly wiped out. Lawrence, under orders not to leave his ship, never set foot on land. He blamed General Thomas Wentworth, who looked down on American troops and confined them to ships for weeks. Still, Lawrence never gave up on Britain. Returning to Virginia, he was appointed Adjutant General, responsible for organizing the colony's militia companies. When his father handed him management of the Little Hunting Creek estate, Lawrence renamed it Mount Vernon to honor the admiral who had inspired him. George, looking up to his brother, had once hoped to receive a proper education like him, a classical education, Latin, French, classical philosophy. But that hope was shattered on April 12th in 1743, the day his father suddenly died at the age of 49. George, just 11 years old, inherited Ferry Farm, though his mother, Mary, retained control. She was strict, so much so that their relationship became distant. George even addressed her as Madam in letters. He constantly sought to escape her control, especially through visits to Mount Vernon with his brother. There is no detailed record of George's early education, but it was likely limited. He learned basic math, business skills, and economics, and taught himself by reading books on philosophy, history, and contemporary fiction. He enjoyed swimming in the Rappahannock, loved horseback riding, and showed early signs of physical prowess. But one regret haunted George. He never learned French, Latin, or Greek, the standard languages of the intellectual elite. While his future peers, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, were sharp minds who laid America's ideological foundation, George had only practical, straightforward intelligence. Yet he once said, "I'm not good at reasoning, but I know how to turn ideas into action." Without his father, George relied more and more on Lawrence, who had married Anne Fairfax, daughter of one of Virginia's most powerful families. Her father, Colonel William Fairfax, managed over 5 million acres on behalf of Lord Fairfax in England. This connection brought George into the orbit of the colonial elite, where he befriended George William Fairfax and began to contemplate his own future. In 1746, Lawrence and the Fairfax family planned to help George join the Royal Navy as a way to free him from his mother's grip. But Mary, unwilling to lose a capable farm manager, blocked the plan. Unable to go to sea, George changed course, becoming a land surveyor at 15, a respected, well-paid profession during the British expansion westward. It honed his skills in terrain observation and map-reading tools that would follow him throughout his military career. His first job, in spring 1748, was helping the Fairfax family subdivide their vast lands for development. Just a few years later, George had purchased over 2,000 acres himself, marking the first step in building his personal land empire by the time he turned 20. In 1752, tragedy struck again. Lawrence, his brother, mentor, and role model, died of tuberculosis at 34, leaving behind a wife and young daughter. His will stated that if he died, Mount Vernon would go to George. Lawrence's death left more than an orphaned child. It carved a wound in George's heart that would never fully heal. He had hoped to follow in Lawrence's footsteps, and now only land, memories, and an uncertain future remained. After much lobbying and persistent effort with Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia, George Washington, the young man from rural Virginia, finally secured a notable position. In February 1753, he was appointed adjutant general in his home region with the rank of major. It wasn't a glamorous beginning, but destiny had far greater plans. At the time, the North American continent was no longer peaceful. The British and French empires, two global giants, had each laid claim to vast territories in the New World. The British held 13 colonies stretching along the Atlantic coast, reaching to the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains. The French controlled the Mississippi River, the Great Lakes, and extended all the way north to the St. Lawrence River. Between them lay the fertile Ohio Valley, a magnet for both powers. In 1752, the French began secretly constructing forts in the contested territory. A year later, Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie, a man with substantial holdings in the Ohio Company, received approval from London to respond. The order was clear: build a British fort and demand the French withdraw from the region. The messenger chosen to deliver that ultimatum was none other than George Washington, then just 21 years old. In November 1753, he led a small group through the Allegheny Mountains into dangerous wilderness. His mission wasn't just diplomatic. He secretly observed and recorded details about French positions, troop strength, and terrain. By January 1754, he returned to Williamsburg, capital of the Virginia colony. His journal, detailed and precise, was turned into an official report sent to London. And with that, many began to see the outline of a promising military leader. Not long after, Washington received a new mission. He was ordered to lead a militia force to the forks of the Ohio, the confluence of 3 rivers, a strategically vital location. The objective: construct a fort to assert British control. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel, but soon discovered the bitter truth: American officers like him were paid far less than British officers serving the crown. In early April, Washington led 160 men across the wilderness. There, he received troubling news: the French had beaten them to it, seizing the British fort under construction and renaming it Fort Duquesne, after the governor of Canada. Unwilling to accept defeat, Washington set up camp and called for reinforcements. On May 28, 1754, he encountered a small French detachment hiding in the woods, believing they were spies or scouts. He ordered an ambush. A brief firefight broke out and the French surrendered. However, amid the chaos, a French officer delivering a diplomatic message requesting the British evacuate the Ohio district was allegedly killed brutally by one of Washington's Native American allies. That incident ignited a diplomatic firestorm. In the colonies, Washington was hailed as a hero, but in London he was viewed with suspicion. His actions were seen as reckless, undisciplined, dangerous. Anticipating retaliation, Washington hurriedly built a wooden fort, naming it Fort Necessity. When his superior officer died in a riding accident, Washington assumed full command of the regiment, promoted to colonel. Though warned that the fort was poorly positioned and indefensible, he chose to stay even as his native allies abandoned the site. On July 3rd, French and Native American forces launched an attack. Washington fought to the end but lost nearly a third of his men and was forced to surrender. It was a humiliating defeat, a string of youthful errors, inexperience, overconfidence, and underestimating the enemy. But George did not collapse. He learned his first great lesson: weak forts are death traps, and the enemy's hit-and-run tactics were unlike anything the British had ever faced. This defeat could have ended his military career forever. But strangely, many colonists saw him as a brave fighter who had resisted against the odds. While the regiment was disbanded and Washington lost his formal command, a personal shift occurred. Lawrence's stepdaughter passed away in December. His widow, Anne, remarried, and George leased Mount Vernon from her, transforming it into his permanent home. In February 1755, another turning point arrived. General Edward Braddock, along with 2 regiments from Britain, landed in Virginia. Washington quickly offered his assistance and was accepted as one of Braddock's aides. In June, he left Mount Vernon, entrusting it to his brother Jack, and joined the march toward Fort Duquesne. Though somewhat fond of Washington, Braddock looked down on colonial soldiers, calling them clumsy and undisciplined. George advised him to move with more flexibility, but Braddock ignored the warning. Only when the march became too slow did Braddock reluctantly adjust his tactics. On July 9th, with over 2,000 troops, they approached Fort Duquesne confident and prepared. But the defenders, just 900 French and native soldiers, had set a perfect ambush. Once again, guerrilla tactics proved devastating. In the chaos, Washington galloped through the battlefield, rallying troops, issuing orders. 2 horses were shot out from under him, but he refused to stop. Braddock was mortally wounded. The battle was lost, but Washington survived and emerged a hero in the eyes of the survivors. The Virginia Regiment was reformed with George as its official commander. Still, he remained frustrated. He had no royal commission, and London seemed uninterested in Virginia's war. When Britain shifted focus to attacking French Canada, Washington found himself idle, left only to train troops while watching many of them desert. In late 1757, he fell gravely ill and returned to Mount Vernon to recover. There, he began improving the estate, envisioning the dream home of a true English gentleman. In early 1758, he met Martha Dandridge Custis, a warm, wealthy young widow, the opposite of his strict mother. They quickly became engaged. She had 2 children. Her husband had died the previous summer. Martha would become his unwavering partner, supporting Washington not only in domestic life, but also in managing Mount Vernon during his absences. In July 1758, Washington returned to the battlefield. Now, under General John Forbes, the British were determined to avenge Braddock and reclaim Fort Duquesne. Politically, George also made his debut, elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, representing Frederick County. Despite some clashes with superiors and a friendly fire incident that killed 20 of his men, Washington proved his mettle. In November 1758, he led 2,500 men toward Fort Duquesne. He expected fierce resistance as he'd seen before, but this time there was none. As his troops approached, they found the fort abandoned. The French, after falling out with their native allies, had quietly withdrawn, destroying the fort before they left. Washington captured it without a single shot, a silent yet complete victory. The British rebuilt it from the ruins and gave it a new name, Fort Pitt, in honor of War Minister William Pitt. And from those ashes, a new city was born. It would be called Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, a symbol of both victory and rebirth. This was also Washington's final direct involvement in the conflict Americans would later call the French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. A brutal, global struggle where Britain and France, fueled by entangled alliances, waged war until 1763. On January 6, 1759, George Washington returned to his Mount Vernon estate and married Martha Custis. This marriage not only brought him companionship, but also elevated him to one of the wealthiest landowners in Virginia. With aspirations of aligning himself with the British aristocracy, Washington began importing the latest fashions from London, but the cost of that lifestyle was deeper dependency on British agents. He gradually realized that behind the glamour was a tightly woven web of control, one that turned colonial planters like him into debtors. Still, he remained active in politics. He served in the House of Burgesses, joined military committees, and spoke only when it truly mattered. Over the next 2 decades, Washington devoted himself to agriculture. Tobacco was his main crop, but he soon saw it was a mistake. The weather too unpredictable, prices constantly fluctuating on the global market. Each harvest season only added to his debts with creditors in London. Tobacco was not only labor-intensive, it demanded a large workforce, and so, like most plantation owners of the time, Washington relied heavily on enslaved labor. Over his lifetime, he would own more than 600 people. In the beginning, he viewed them as property bought, sold, traded like livestock. But over time and with the stirrings of conscience, that view began to change. He started caring about their health and made a critical decision: he would not sell anyone so families could stay together. When the French and Indian War ended in 1763, it was a victory for Britain. France lost Canada to the British, and Louisiana went to Spain. But that victory came at a steep price. The British treasury was nearly empty, and over half the national budget now went to paying interest on loans. In financial desperation, the British Parliament turned to the colonies, imposing new taxes and banning westward expansion. Washington, once a proud officer who had fought under the British flag, felt betrayed. He had been denied a formal rank in the Royal Army. And now, as a businessman, he saw clearly Britain's policies weren't just short-sighted, they directly harmed landowners like him. The breaking point came with the Stamp Act of 1765. A tax was imposed on every printed document: newspapers, legal papers, even playing cards. Although not the most radical voice at the time, Washington made his stance clear. He called it a violation of constitutional rights. In a letter to his representative in London, he warned the colonies would boycott British goods, courts would shut down, and British creditors would struggle to collect debts from the American people. Around this time, concerned about his dependence on British credit, Washington began a shift, diversifying production. He abandoned tobacco, switching to wheat, corn, hemp, and dozens of other crops. The Potomac River beside Mount Vernon provided abundant fish initially for family use, then salted and sold for export. As production expanded, more labor was needed. To avoid wasting manpower, Washington trained surplus enslaved workers as carpenters, blacksmiths, masons, bakers. Turning enslaved individuals into skilled craftsmen was part of his broader strategy for self-sufficiency. Though Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, it still insisted on the right to tax the colonies. Once again, unrest returned. In 1767, the Townshend Acts imposed new duties on paint, lead, glass, paper, and tea. By the winter of 1768-69, Washington could no longer remain silent. He strongly supported the boycott of British goods, and while not rejecting armed resistance, he still prioritized nonviolent measures. In April 1769, Washington took a proactive stand in the House of Burgesses. With his close friend George Mason, he helped draft a plan to control imports from Britain. The following month, the Assembly passed a series of resolutions affirming that only Virginians had the right to tax Virginians. The British response came down like a hammer. Governor Lord Boutetourt dissolved the legislature, forcing lawmakers to meet in a tavern instead. But that didn't stop them. In the fiery atmosphere of that tavern, they passed Washington's very proposal, a full boycott of all goods taxed under the Townshend Acts. This bold move forced Britain to partially back down. Under Prime Minister Lord North, most taxes were repealed, except one, the tax on tea. And so another spark was lit. On December 16, 1773, the Boston Tea Party erupted. A group of patriots from the Sons of Liberty boarded East India Company ships and dumped valuable tea into Boston Harbor. Washington didn't entirely agree with such radical action, but when he saw Britain's response, his temper broke. The harsh retaliatory measures, including a blockade of Boston's port, became known as the Intolerable Acts. Washington was outraged. In the House of Burgesses, he backed a call for a Continental Congress, a unified gathering of the 13 colonies to show solidarity. In July 1774, at a meeting in Fairfax County, where he had served as representative for nearly a decade, Washington and Mason co-authored the Fairfax Resolves. Its declaration rang with defiance. Taxation and representation are, in their nature, inseparable. From that moment on, George Washington was no longer just a plantation owner. He had become one of the leading voices in the movement for American resistance against the British Empire. On August 5th, amid rising political tension, George Washington was elected as one of 7 delegates representing Virginia at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, scheduled for the following month. There, among the towering minds of the age, alongside eloquent voices like Patrick Henry and John Adams, Washington spoke little, but whenever he did, the room went silent. Few words, but each one struck its mark. As the atmosphere of the Congress grew increasingly tense, as talk shifted from negotiation to confrontation, one name kept rising: George Washington. At 42, he had shed the youthful awkwardness of earlier years. In its place, calm, composure, confidence. He didn't campaign, didn't push himself forward. He didn't need to. His reputation spoke louder than words. At the time, the Continental Congress still hoped for a peaceful solution. They formed the Continental Association, coordinating a united boycott of British goods. But then everything changed. April 19th, 1775, in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. The first shots were fired. Colonial militiamen clashed with British redcoats. The American Revolution had officially begun. Washington was once again selected to represent Virginia, this time at the Second Continental Congress, which opened on May 10th. The mood was now entirely different. No more talk of petitions. Now, the focus was on raising militias and recruiting volunteers. Washington entered the hall in full colonel's uniform, a symbol of resolve. His military experience, his composed yet firm demeanor, earned widespread respect. On June 14th, Congress voted to take command of the militia besieging the British Army in Boston. And 2 days later, June 16th, they made a historic decision. They appointed George Washington as General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies. As he journeyed to Boston to take command, Washington received news of a bloody confrontation, the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th. Though the British, under General William Howe, took the ground, they paid dearly. Nearly 1,000 casualties out of 2,000 men. It was proof the colonial militia would not break easily. When Washington arrived in Boston, he faced his first true test, transforming a ragtag force into a national army. But what he saw was disheartening. Only about 14,000 troops were combat-ready. They lived in squalid conditions, lacking even basic supplies, especially gunpowder. Washington kept these problems quiet, confiding only in trusted allies, wary of British spies. During this time, he grew close to Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene, a young officer from Rhode Island, and 25-year-old artillery colonel Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller who had taught himself military theory through reading and conversations with British officers. Washington worked tirelessly to build a professional army, but volunteer enlistments lasted only a year. Just as men were trained and ready to fight, their terms expired, and they left. Facing the prospect of losing nearly the entire force on January 1st, 1776, Washington made a personal appeal urging his men to re-enlist. But by year's end, fewer than 10,000 remained. To boost numbers, he considered recruiting black soldiers. In Massachusetts, many black militiamen had already fought bravely, but as a slave-owning Virginian, Washington knew arming black men would stoke fear of slave revolt. So in October, during a military council, he banned black enlistment in the Continental Army. But then the situation shifted. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, declared that any enslaved person who joined the British Army would be granted freedom. Washington had no choice but to relent. He allowed free black men to enlist. Eventually, they made up nearly 10% of the Continental Army. Then came winter, brutal and cold. Washington couldn't return to Mount Vernon as he had hoped. Instead, he invited his wife, Martha, to join him. Throughout the war, Martha Washington spent nearly half her time by his side. Not just a wife, but a confidant. The person he turned to when burdened by doubt and exhaustion. Still, the Army's condition was dire. Morale plummeted. Many soldiers wondered, was this a hopeless dream? In Philadelphia, the politicians were still divided. Some clung to the idea of appealing to King George III, hoping for reconciliation. But then in January 1776, a fire ignited. Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a small book with enormous power. It savaged monarchy as rotten tyranny and urged Americans to rise and claim independence. And then a moment that lit a spark in the soldiers' hearts. January the 17th, Henry Knox returned. After a heroic journey across the frozen wilderness, he had dragged nearly 60 cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Washington's camp. They didn't have enough gunpowder for a full assault, but Washington saw the opportunity. On the night of March 4th, he quietly positioned the artillery atop Dorchester Heights, overlooking all of Boston. By morning, the British awoke and realized they had no choice. They had to retreat. Without losing a single soldier, Washington had secured his first major victory. Wasting no time, he marched his army to New York, correctly anticipating it would be the British's next target. A dense port city complex terrain and a strong loyalist presence. But Washington understood losing New York would mean losing enormous political and commercial value. Though outnumbered, he would not retreat. The call for independence was echoing across the land. And on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, was ratified by Congress. On July 8th, Washington read it aloud to the troops. And for the first time, those soldiers were no longer colonists. They were Americans, fighting for liberty. The joy after the Declaration of Independence came too soon. Just weeks later, British forces led by the Howe brothers, William and Richard, arrived in New York with a massive army of 32,000 soldiers and over 70 warships looming offshore. Their objective was crush the rebellion before it had any chance to grow. By mid-August, Washington had roughly 23,000 troops under his command, but most of them were green recruits, young men who had never even smelled gunpowder. When the British landed the bulk of their forces on Long Island, Washington, believing it was merely a diversion, kept most of his army stationed in Manhattan. Only 6,000 men were sent to defend the Brooklyn Heights. It was a strategic mistake. On August 26th, the British launched a surprise flanking maneuver surrounding the American troops. The bloody clash left over 300 dead and more than 1,000 captured. But on the night of August 29th, with a thick fog blanketing the East River, Washington pulled off the unthinkable. He organized a full retreat of his army from Long Island, right under the nose of the British. The last boat to leave shore had him on board. The fog masked every oar stroke. The enemy suspected nothing. A few days later, he ordered another withdrawal from Manhattan, moving northward. They built 2 forts along the Hudson River, Fort Washington and Fort Lee, but by November, both had fallen. The Continental Army was forced to flee again, this time into New Jersey. A string of defeats sparked public doubt. Was Washington truly capable of leading this war? Even one of his own generals, Charles Lee, began plotting to undermine and replace him. Washington discovered the plot but said nothing. Then fate intervened. In mid-December, Charles Lee was captured by British forces during an ambush. By then, Washington's army had dwindled to less than 4,000 men. They crossed the Delaware River, reaching Pennsylvania, while the British closed in on Philadelphia, forcing the Continental Congress to evacuate to Baltimore. The situation resembled a chessboard cornered with no escape. But Washington refused to give in. With a few thousand fresh reinforcements under Horatio Gates, he drafted a bold plan. Return to the Delaware on Christmas night to launch a surprise attack on 3 Hessian regiments stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington believed that on that holiday night, the enemy would let their guard down, maybe even be drunk. On the night of December 25th, a snowstorm howled, icy winds, thick snowfall. The troops didn't make it across the river until 4 a.m. the next morning, but they didn't stop. They pressed on along the frozen riverbank, heading for Trenton. The Hessians were still alert, but none of them believed Washington would attack in such brutal conditions, and that proved their undoing. Exploiting the element of surprise combined with effective artillery fire from Henry Knox, Washington's forces quickly broke the enemy formation and repelled all counterattacks. Within hours, the Hessians began to surrender en masse. The result, over 100 killed or wounded, 900 captured. Washington lost fewer than 10 men. History often remembers him as a defensive general, cautious, reserved, but Trenton proved otherwise. He could and would launch daring attacks when the moment demanded it. Just days later, he secured another resounding victory at Princeton, driving British forces out of nearly all of New Jersey. Morale soared. Congress returned to Philadelphia, but his army remained thin, only a few thousand men. Washington couldn't risk another major engagement. He was forced to return to defensive operations. Instead, he launched hit-and-run raids, striking enemy posts, destroying supply depots, disrupting logistics. In March 1777, a new figure joined Washington's staff, Alexander Hamilton, a 22-year-old artillery captain. Intelligent, agile, with an uncanny ability to manage correspondence and military orders, Hamilton quickly became Washington's right-hand man. By late July, another extraordinary figure arrived at the camp, the Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman, only 20 years old. Defying a royal ban, Lafayette had crossed the ocean to volunteer for the American cause. A Frenchman fighting for American freedom. Washington sensed something in the young man, a spark, a bond, and that was only the beginning. There was one thing Washington always believed: if America wanted true freedom, it needed a real ally. and for him that hope rested with France. With backing from Lafayette, the young aristocrat with a revolutionary heart, both Washington and the Continental Congress hoped France would side with the United States against the British Empire. Throughout the first half of 1777, Washington held a defensive posture, consolidating his forces, waiting to see General Howe's next move. By late August, the answer came. Howe landed his troops in the Chesapeake Bay and marched straight for Philadelphia. The capital was in danger. Washington couldn't afford to lose the city. He rushed to deploy troops, setting up defensive lines along the ridges surrounding Brandywine Creek, southwest of Philadelphia, preparing for a decisive battle. On September 11th, the British attack began. Howe split his army in two. One force of 5,000 Hessian troops launched a frontal assault on Washington's center, while Howe himself led over 8,000 men in a flanking maneuver, crossing the river at unguarded fords to launch a surprise strike from the rear. At first, the Continental line held, but by noon, Washington sensed something was off. Reports of enemy movement on the flank arrived, and he rode out personally to investigate. What he found were only 2 British brigades, unaware that Howe's entire main force was rapidly closing in. By around 4 p.m., the full British army engaged. 3 wings struck the Continental positions simultaneously. The result? Chaos. Over 1,000 American casualties, including 400 taken prisoner. British losses, less than half. Philadelphia fell. Congress evacuated again, this time to Trenton. Despite the bravery of his troops, the defeat at Brandywine dealt a serious blow to Washington's reputation. Once again, critics accused him of poor preparation, sluggish response, and leading his men into defeat, but he did not fall. Less than a month later, on October 3rd, Washington launched a counterattack. The target, the British camp at Germantown. A daring night assault reminiscent of his brilliant victory at Trenton the year before, but this time, things fell apart. Confusion in the dark shattered the plan, and Washington was forced to retreat. This time, American losses were twice that of the British. He tried to soften the blow in reports to Congress, and though they had lost the spirit of the Continental Army held firm, they had shown something undeniable even after a brutal beating. They were still willing to fight to the end. While Washington struggled against Howe, a ray of hope appeared from the north. On October 17th, General Horatio Gates achieved a stunning victory at Saratoga, New York capturing 5,000 British troops under General John Burgoyne, who had been marching south to join Howe. The nation rejoiced, but Washington felt something else. Gates had long been a vocal critic. Now, he seemed poised to and that fear soon became real. Congress appointed Gates as president of the Board of War, giving him oversight over Washington and his army. Not only that, they brought in Thomas Conway as Inspector General, granting him near total authority over training and discipline without needing Washington's approval. They even promoted Conway to Major General. When Conway arrived at Valley Forge to announce it, Washington could no longer stay silent. He firmly declared that his officers would not recognize Conway's authority. That pushback forced Congress to reassign Conway elsewhere, and Washington held his command. Then came the winter that would enter Legend Valley Forge, 1777-78. Freezing cold, hunger, disease. It drained the life out of the army. Thousands fell ill, frostbitten, despairing. The army hovered on the edge of collapse. Washington sent urgent letters to Congress for supplies, but nothing came. The Articles of Confederation, America's temporary constitution, had left most power with the individual states, rendering Congress almost powerless. Yet in that devastation, Washington remained. He didn't abandon his men even though he could have. And beside him, Martha Washington. She didn't just bring boots, blankets, and food, she brought hope. She was warmth, helping those soldiers endure just a bit longer. Then another figure arrived, Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer who had once served under Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War. The Prussian army, regarded as Europe's finest, was known for discipline and precision, qualities the Continental Army sorely lacked. With iron discipline and scientific training methods, von Steuben got to work. He taught the men how to march, how to drill, how to handle bayonets, how to transform a mob into an army. He compiled everything into a training manual, one the U.S. military would use for nearly a century. In just a few months, Washington had 12,000 troops ready to fight again. And then the greatest gift came from Paris. On February 6, 1778, France officially signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. That alliance changed everything. British General Sir Henry Clinton, who had replaced Howe, was forced to abandon Philadelphia, dispatching 8,000 troops to protect the West Indies from possible French attack. As Clinton retreated, Washington seized the opportunity. He placed General Charles Lee, recently freed via prisoner exchange, in charge of a 5,000-man vanguard. The goal: strike the enemy at Monmouth Courthouse. But Lee lacked confidence in the plan. He hesitated, engaged half-heartedly, and was easily driven back. The Continental line faltered. Washington, furious, galloped to the front with 6,000 fresh troops. He personally reorganized the line and turned the battle around. 2 hours of fierce combat, and the British were forced to withdraw under cover of darkness. Washington chose not to pursue. His men were exhausted. After the Battle of Monmouth, Lee was court-martialed and convicted. Washington made no effort to hide his satisfaction. Over the next 3 years, the war's focus gradually shifted south, where the British concentrated most of their troops and strategy. As for Washington, he avoided large-scale battles, but don't mistake that for inaction. In the summer of 1778, the French fleet for the first time sailed into the Chesapeake Bay to coordinate with the American rebels. But collaboration between a fledgling republic and an old monarchy proved difficult. Americans, long disgusted by monarchy, quickly realized that France wasn't supporting them out of a love for liberty, but out of deep-rooted hatred for Britain. Washington once again had to endure poor coordination from European officers. Many refused to report back, and looked down on the Continental Army as little more than undisciplined militias. By the summer of 1779, he managed to block Clinton's attempt to control the Hudson River, which would have cut New England off from the rest of the country. But beyond that success, the war remained relatively quiet. By 1780, the situation turned desperate. Washington's army was exhausted, lacking food, money, morale, and military success. Without reinforcements from France, victory seemed nearly impossible. Fortunately, Lafayette, who had returned to France in 1779, used every connection he had to rally support for the revolution. King Louis XVI responded by sending a 6,000-man expeditionary force, led by Count Rochambeau, along with a naval fleet under Admiral de Ternay, landing in Newport, Rhode Island on July 10, 1780. Meanwhile, in the South American forces were being crushed. Charleston, South Carolina fell in May. Horatio Gates, once the hero of Saratoga, was decisively defeated at Camden just 3 months later by General Cornwallis. Humiliated, Gates was dismissed by Congress, stepping down and leaving full command to Washington. But the biggest shock was still ahead. In September, Washington learned something he could scarcely believe. Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga, had betrayed the cause. Once a courageous officer passed over repeatedly for promotion, Arnold had grown bitter and eventually sold out his ideals. In August, he had been given command of West Point, a strategic fortress on the Hudson River, but instead of strengthening defenses, Arnold secretly plotted to hand it over to the British. When the plan was discovered, he fled, escaping justice by mere minutes. By 1781, with British victories in the South and Arnold's betrayal, the state of Virginia, Washington's own homeland, was under threat. British forces advanced, even capturing Monticello, the residence of Governor Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson urgently called on Washington to bring troops south to defend the state. Still, Washington didn't act immediately. He believed the decisive battle would come in New York, not Virginia. He sent a small force under Lafayette to counter Arnold, but kept his main army in the north, where he thought the war would be won or lost. Everything changed in mid-August. News arrived in waves: a powerful French fleet, 29 warships under Admiral de Grasse, had left the West Indies, heading straight for the Chesapeake Bay. On board, 3,500 troops, ready to land by early September. At the same time, Lafayette reported back Cornwallis had retreated to Yorktown, a vulnerable position at the tip of a peninsula in Virginia, surrounded on 3 sides by water. The golden opportunity had arrived. Washington and Rochambeau moved fast, marching their combined forces south, aiming to trap Cornwallis before the British could react. By early September, the French fleet arrived on schedule, blocking any British resupply. Cornwallis, now pinned between French ships at sea and Lafayette's forces on land, had no way out. On September 18th, Washington and Rochambeau met with de Grasse to finalize the siege plan. But there was a problem. The admiral warned he had to leave the American coast by November 1st. That meant they had just over 1 month to end the campaign. On September 28th, the siege of Yorktown began. Washington gave tactical command to Rochambeau, who had far more experience with formal siege warfare. Cornwallis, with 9,000 troops, was completely surrounded by an Allied force twice his size. Desperate, he sent letters to General Clinton pleading for reinforcements, but time was not on his side. French engineers quickly dug 2 siege lines, allowing the Allies to bombard Yorktown with relentless cannon fire. On October 14th, they stormed and captured 2 key British outposts. By October 16th, the trenches had advanced dangerously close to British defenses. In a final gamble, Cornwallis tried to flee across the York River under cover of night, but bad weather ruined the plan. High winds and waves scattered his boats. On the morning of October 17, 1781, Cornwallis sent a letter requesting terms of surrender. 2 days later, October 19th, he formally signed the documents. The siege was over. Yorktown, while not the final shot of the war, delivered the fatal blow to Britain's will to fight. When news reached London, it struck like lightning. Prime Minister Lord North, upon hearing it, could only mutter, "Oh God, it's all over." His government collapsed in early 1782. General Clinton was replaced by Sir Guy Carleton, whose task wasn't to win the war, but to manage Britain's withdrawal. With Yorktown, The balance of power shifted and the destiny of a new nation was finally within reach. When peace proposals were offered by British General Carleton, George Washington remained cautious. He didn't fully trust them, still preparing for the possibility of more bloodshed, still believing the war might not be truly over. Yet the battlefield told another story by early 1782, aside from a few scattered skirmishes in the south. The guns had mostly gone silent. Then, on November 30th, 1782, a day that changed history. In Paris, the preliminary peace terms were signed. The United States, a fledgling nation born from the flames of revolution, was now officially recognized as independent. And not only that the newly defined territory was astoundingly vast, stretching from the northern Great Lakes all the way west to the Mississippi River. A new empire was taking shape. And in September 1783, the peace agreement was formally ratified. He could have claimed it all power, prestige, a loyal army, fame echoing across 13 states. But George Washington chose a different path one few men would ever dare take. On December 23, 1783, he resigned, stepped away from all power, and returned to Mount Vernon as a private citizen. People called him the Cincinnatus of the New World after the Roman general who once saved the Republic, then humbly returned to his farm. Washington didn't do it for glory. He did it for principle. A belief that a true republic must be built on sacrifice, not ambition. When he returned to Mount Vernon, he found once prosperous fields now overgrown from years of war. He threw himself into restoring the estate, plowing, planting, calculating every crop cycle. But beyond agriculture, Washington faced a deeper question, the issue of slavery. By this time, many influential figures, including Lafayette, were urging him to support a plan for gradual emancipation. Lafayette even proposed a bold idea: transform slaves into tenant farmers, educate them, give them land, and let them live freely. Washington, who had long doubted slavery's economic viability, now began to sense its moral contradiction. But he still hesitated. Behind that hesitation lay a harsh truth, like many planters. His economy still depended on enslaved labor. He believed that someday the system would fade away on its own. A belief, perhaps naive. He tried to avoid politics, but the name Washington wouldn't allow him to stay hidden for long. During the war, he had longed for a strong national government so that he wouldn't have to beg each state for men and supplies. That conviction had not wavered. When Alexander Hamilton and James Madison began pushing for a revision of the Articles of Confederation, they invited Washington to lead the Virginia delegation at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. After months of hesitation, he agreed. And on May 25, 1787, Washington was elected president of the Constitutional Convention. In that role, he presided over heated debates. Large states like Virginia wanted proportional representation based on population. Smaller states, fearing domination, demanded equal voting power. In July, a compromise was struck: 2 senators per state, while seats in the House would be based on population. But another, more troubling compromise emerged on slavery. Even though slaves had no right to vote, Southern states were allowed to count 3/5 of their enslaved population toward their total, increasing their representation. A deeply controversial mechanism, but the only way to keep the South within the Union. The convention also created an independent executive branch, and all eyes turned to Washington as the likely first president. The Constitution was completed on September 17, 1787, but wouldn't be ratified until July 1788. Washington's home state, Virginia, was among the last to approve it. As support for him to become president grew, Washington felt uneasy. He feared accepting the role might suggest monarchical ambition, but his image as America's Cincinnatus, combined with the fact that he had no children, helped quell fears of hereditary rule. In early 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. John Adams became vice president, and on April 30th, 1789, Washington took the oath of office in New York City, then the provisional capital. At that time, the Constitution was still vague, the president's powers unclear. Both Congress and Washington had to define the rules to write the script for modern democracy. In the spring of 1790, Washington formed the first cabinet with just 4 men: Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury; Henry Knox, Secretary of War; Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State; Edmund Randolph, Attorney General. The Constitution said nothing about such a cabinet, and Washington often worked directly with his department heads. James Madison, father of the Constitution and member of the House, served as a close advisor in this early period. Washington also leaned heavily on Madison's counsel. Meanwhile, John Adams held a more ceremonial role, serving as president of the Senate. But Hamilton stood out. He worked like a whirlwind, aiming to strengthen federal authority and propose sweeping financial reforms. Unlike the president, Hamilton had a grand vision for the structure of the federal government and financial expertise far beyond Washington's own. He became, in effect, a prime minister without the title. Opposing him, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson distrusted Hamilton's ideas, believing they would lead to executive tyranny, and he quietly criticized Washington for supporting them. But Washington did not stay passive. Though he allowed open debate within the cabinet, he personally reviewed every bill, every word, every detail before approval. He sought wide input, something he had never been able to do as a general. In January 1790, with the new republic still financially unstable, Hamilton introduced a bold plan. He presented his report on public credit to Congress, proposing a national debt, funded over time, backed by new taxes. More controversially, he wanted the federal government to assume all state debts from the Revolutionary War. With this, he cleverly redirected creditor loyalty away from the states toward the central government. Unsurprisingly, Washington fully supported it. He shared Hamilton's belief that a strong national government, able to borrow and repay its debts, would be the foundation of American power. And because he trusted his Treasury Secretary, he let Hamilton handle the details. But not everyone agreed. James Madison, once a close ally, began to feel uneasy. Discussions of new taxes reminded him of British colonial rule, and he turned against Hamilton's plan. Madison publicly opposed it in Congress, breaking the once solid triangle of Washington, Hamilton, and Madison. Washington, though discreet, couldn't hide his disappointment. He lost a friend and saw the first major fracture between North and South, a fracture that would never truly heal. Still, the president stood by Hamilton, especially when he proposed another controversial idea, a national bank. Jefferson and many Southern leaders claimed it was unconstitutional, but Washington unshaken approved it, believing it would strengthen the economy. Then came another debate. Where would the permanent capital be? Southern states wanted it farther south. Madison proposed a site in Virginia, along the Potomac River, where both he and Washington owned land. Naturally, Washington didn't object. But Congress was deadlocked. Debt and capital location, two issues paralyzing the government. Then, in June 1790, a secret meeting was held. 3 men, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison. Inside that room, a political bargain was struck. The Virginians agreed not to block Hamilton's economic plan. In exchange, Hamilton would support moving the capital temporarily to Philadelphia for 10 years. During that time, a new federal city would be built on the Potomac River. Washington, as president, had final say on its location. He chose land not far from Mount Vernon. The commissioners he appointed later named the city Washington, in the District of Columbia. And so, 2 crises that once threatened to tear the Union apart were resolved, thanks in part to Hamilton's force, but above all to the calm authority of George Washington. Yet the debate over federal power was far from over. It was just beginning, and soon it would reach foreign policy. Despite the war with Britain, both Washington and Hamilton knew America needed trade with England to survive. Jefferson, having served as ambassador to Paris, backed revolutionary France, especially after the monarchy fell in 1789, and Lafayette rose as one of the movement's leaders, inspired by the liberty he had fought for in America. But Washington began to worry that France's revolution was spinning out of control. In September 1792, those fears were confirmed. The Jacobins seized power, executing King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Lafayette, his old friend, was forced into exile. The political climate in America had become suffocating. Hamilton and Jefferson, the 2 main figures in the cabinet, were irreconcilable. And Washington, caught in the middle, watched helplessly as the nation split into 2 camps, the Federalists and the Republicans. He had once been the great unifier at the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention, but now, surrounded by schemers who attacked each other through anonymous newspapers, he felt small. Washington had planned to step down after his first term, but ironically, both Hamilton and Jefferson, his greatest rivals, begged him to stay. They believed he was the only one who could hold the nation together. And so, in the winter of 1792, he was re-elected unanimously. John Adams continued as vice president, defeating Jefferson. But the House had shifted toward the Republican camp, and the second term would be a stormy 1-8. September 1796. George Washington, the founding father who had led America out of the shadows of war, officially prepared to step down from public life. In a farewell address, penned by Alexander Hamilton and published in newspapers rather than delivered to a crowd, he issued one final plea: stay united, protect the young republic, avoid permanent alliances and lasting hostilities. But as Washington withdrew from the spotlight, that warning was quickly ignored. On March 4, 1797, John Adams succeeded him, becoming the second president of the United States. And from there, everything began to fracture. The confrontation between the Federalists and the Republicans grew increasingly fierce. Political battles, vicious newspaper wars, and fears of war with France pushed the nation into a spiral of deep division. By 1798, with war seeming inevitable once again, eyes turned to Washington, and once again he left his farm at Mount Vernon and accepted the role of commander-in-chief of the army, one last time. But not everything went smoothly. Washington wanted Alexander Hamilton as his second-in-command, bypassing veteran generals like Henry Knox. but President Adams, who already disliked Hamilton, firmly opposed the move. That decision fractured the relationship between Washington, Adams, and Knox, a rift that would never fully heal. Fortunately, diplomacy with France prevailed. War was averted, and Washington, now elderly, returned once more to Mount Vernon, retreating into the familiar rhythms of rural life. Though his health declined, he remained immersed in work managing the estate, tending the fields, writing letters to friends, as if he still had much to do, until one fateful day. On December 12th, 1799, he rode horseback for over 5 hours around the plantation, just as a sudden snowstorm swept in. The cold settled deep into a body no longer young. Just 2 days later, he collapsed. On the night of December 14th, 1799, George Washington drew his final breath. He passed away quietly, without fanfare, just as he had lived in his final years. Before his death, he had prepared a will. In it, he left all his estate to Martha, and he declared that upon her passing, the 120 enslaved people still under his ownership would be freed. A decision layered with meaning, and one of the rare seeds of remorse in an era when slavery remained the economic foundation of the South. However, Martha had not been consulted, and then fear crept in. She worried that if the enslaved people knew they would gain freedom upon her death, then her end might come sooner than expected. So on New Year's Day, 1801, she chose to free them all. Martha Washington passed away in May 1802. George Washington's death nearly 3 years earlier had left the nation stunned and grieving. From small towns to major cities, memorials were held, tears were shed, and admiration overflowed. And then, the nation looked back. His life had been a thread running through every critical moment in America's birth. Born into a modest colonial family, young George began his military career under British command, chasing dreams of glory and discovering bitter injustice from the very empire he served. In the end, he defeated them. He didn't just win independence for a people. He helped shape the soul of a new nation built on the ideals of liberty and equality. Washington was not only a general, he presided over the Constitutional Convention, laid the foundation of the U.S. political system, became the first president and the model by which all others would be measured. His vision of a strong federal government often put him at odds with Virginia's plantation class, who favored states' rights. But that vision carved the path for America to rise and become a global superpower in the 21st century. George Washington was not just the founder of a country. He was its soul, the heartbeat of a dream just beginning to breathe. The almost sacred reverence Americans have for George Washington in many cases can make it easy to overlook the very real mistakes he made, both on the battlefield and in politics. As a general, Washington was not always victorious. In truth, he lost more battles than he won. The crushing defeats at New York and Brandywine stemmed from serious tactical errors of his own making. And yet he remained the steadfast pillar holding together the Revolutionary Army through the darkest hours. Still, let us not forget the decisive victory at Yorktown would never have been possible without the timely intervention of the French Navy and Army. In politics, Washington also did not possess the sharp intellectual edge of Alexander Hamilton, nor the philosophical foresight of Thomas Jefferson. He believed, perhaps naively, that the young nation could somehow avoid the fractures of partisan division. But history proved him wrong. Not only did such division emerge, It became a defining feature of American political life for centuries to come. On the issue of slavery, Washington, by the end of his life, seemed to hold more progressive views than most of his contemporaries in the Southern planter class. Yet he never dared confront that class directly. These were men with whom he had deep disagreements, especially over their opposition to Hamilton's economic program. Instead, he chose to quietly pass that burden on to the generations of leaders who would follow. So what do you think of George Washington? Was he truly a visionary military leader who united a ragtag army to defeat one of the greatest empires of the age? A pragmatic politician who held the fragile republic together at a time when even the Constitution was still taking shape? Or was he simply a competent general, a dedicated public servant whom history has favored not because of extraordinary genius, but because of steadfast loyalty and unwavering duty?